So first of all, welcome. Welcome to the first Columbia University Library's Comic Symposium, Comic New York. My name is Karen Green. I'm the graphic novels librarian, although I was originally hired as the ancient and medieval history and religion librarian. So I hold two interesting and in many ways complementary positions here. Before I say anything else, I want to send out huge thanks to my fellow organizers of this event, Jeremy Dauber, who's the director of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, and Danny Fingeroth, who, stand up, Danny, who many of you may know as a longtime writer and editor of comics and chronicler of comics, and now the Senior VP of Education at the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art, which you should all join. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees. So, I'm just going to say a few things and then we'll get rolling. And I want to start off by making an observation. When Lee Bollinger became the president of Columbia 10 years ago, his first official speaking engagement was with the library's professional staff. And he said to us, among many other things, that one of our challenges would be to identify disciplines, areas of collection for topics that maybe we didn't even know about yet. So we had to think very far into the future about how we would shape the collection. I'm not sure that when he said that, he had comics in mind. But I have to say that since starting the graphic novels collection here in 2005, I feel like I have at least done a bit to fulfill that pledge. And so here we are at Comic New York. I mentioned that I'm a librarian for medieval history and religion, so I could say that this event has two Genesis stories, but in homage to the context, I will say this event has two origin stories. And it's a tale of two Chris's, one of them being Chris Couch, wave, Chris Couch is a Columbia PhD who's now a professor at a variety of institutions, including SVA downtown, and who contacted a few people nearly 2 years ago, I'd say, thinking that we should talk about a potential event, big comics event here at Columbia. And he called together a group of people. I think the first person he contacted was Danny Fingeroth. And Chris and Danny called together about 6 or 7 of us over lunch. Jeremy was part of that, David Haydu, who'll be moderating a panel later this afternoon, Paul Levitz, other people. And we talked it over. And we thought this was a great idea. And the small committee of Jeremy, Danny, and I was born, and then a lot of lunches ensued. And it was during these lunch talks that the idea grew from a panel to a full-day event to a 2-day event, next time a week. Meanwhile, in another part of the forest, known as Brooklyn, Chris Claremont wanted to donate his archives to a university. And his wife, Beth, contacted a mutual friend of hers and mine who said, "You should talk to Karen Green at Columbia." And so she did, and I was very excited, and I went up to our rare book and manuscript library director, Michael Ryan, because I'm not allowed, I wasn't then allowed to make this kind of decision alone, a new collecting area completely in rare books, and Michael Ryan was very interested, and he said, "Let's pursue it." And so we did, and once that process began, it made sense to publicize that acquisition, which is now, in fact, a done deal, by inviting Chris to be featured in this event, which he will be this evening, this afternoon during the keynote. So as we had our talks, we started with no budget, with no funds. I was going to say all we had was $1 and a dream, but we didn't even really have $1. So we thought we should concentrate on local talent, which is not really a limitation in New York City because you can hardly throw a stone in the city without hitting an aspiring or a successful cartoonist. So what was more difficult was really narrowing it down. But I think what really drove our desire to concentrate on comics in New York was our deep love for this city, for its variety, for its complexity, for its culture, for its history, and for its role in the history of comics. I'm just going to get a little pedantic here. From the first edition of, the American edition of The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck by Rodolphe Töpfer, which was published by Brother Jonathan magazine in 1842, right here in New York City. The same magazine which later published the first comic book written in New York, The Fortunes of Ferdinand Flipper, which you can actually read for free online at the Dartmouth College Digital Library. To the circulation wars with the Yellow Kid, to Spider-Man swinging through the canyons of our skyscrapers, to Will Eisner's incredibly evocative New York City neighborhoods, to local political conflicts in World War III Illustrated, to homey and intimate scenes in the webcomics of many of the people who will be in panels tonight. New York City is always another character in the story of the medium. So the variety of ways to use New York City in comics gave us a kind of template of how we would organize the panels. And I think and I hope you'll see that we've tried to look at very many ways of examining comics in New York City. We have mainstream people, we have alternative people, we have webcomic people, we have people who work in newsprint, in magazines, in webcomics, in comic books, in graphic novels, because this is a medium that contains legions, and we're very lucky to love it the way we do, don't you think? So, comics at Columbia, just a couple of words. It was not a huge collecting area when I proposed the collection, although there appears to have been a benevolent librarian in like the 60s or 70s who bought reprint collections. We have, for example, Crockett Johnson's Barnaby strips in a nice reprint collection from the 60s. But when I proposed the collection, we really had 3 graphic novels, and I bet you can guess at least 2 of them. Mouse, Persepolis, Palestine. These are on course reserves. They were assigned readings for classes. But now we have almost 2,300 titles. And that's titles, not volumes, because of course we have multi-volume sets. And these works are used from the School of the Arts to the program in narrative medicine, and everything in between. It's widely used by teachers for teaching, by students for research, for senior theses, for master's essays, and we hope with the Claremont Archives we will be able to take that into a new direction with unique materials that people can study as well. And I do just want to say that the library administration has been insanely supportive of this from the moment I first proposed it. Our VP of Information Services, our university librarian, Jim Neal, has been an enthusiastic and delighted supporter of this direction, so nothing is going to change here anytime soon. And as I said, now with the Claremont Archives, we have this whole new avenue of unique materials. Scholars and students will be able to come and consult his notes, his drafts, his correspondence, his character studies. We even have a really fabulous headshot of him from the 1970s when he was an aspiring actor with long flowing hair. He laughed very hard when he pulled that one out when we packed them up. Once the archives contents are processed, they will be available, a contents list called a finding aid will be available online, so from the comfort of your home you can take a look and see what we have and see if there's something that you would want to consult. And that is a segue to the subtext of this event, which will now poke its head deeply and prominently into text, which is, for those of you who have archives of material, your notes, your drafts, your correspondence, your character studies, etc., if you would like to consider Columbia University as their final destination, we would welcome them, because there's no point in having Chris's archives sit there lonely and solitary. They need company. So, enough from me. I want to thank our sponsors, profoundly thank our sponsors, because as I mentioned, we started with no funds whatsoever, especially the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, who suggested sponsorship and support when I was still trying to figure out how you book a room on campus. To university programs and events for their incredible generosity, and all of these people are listed on the back of your program. to Alexander Street Press, a wonderful electronic publisher who publishes a database called Underground and Independent Comics. They sponsored the coffee service, so drink up. To Columbia's Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, whose director has been promoting amazing comics events on this campus for the last couple of years, that being Jeremy. To the big two, DC and Marvel, who are inextricably part of the history of comics in New York City. To the American Studies program, a great friend to comics in the curriculum. And finally, to the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation, represented by the Groppers, who are here, which commemorates the man possibly most intimately identified with comics and New York City, Will Eisner. We didn't quite make this for Will Eisner Week, which was the week of his birthday, March 6th, but we're going to make this Will Eisner Month, so there we go. So a round of applause for our sponsors. So we're going to get started with the first panel. I want you to enjoy yourselves, and I will try to do the same. Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Irving. I'm editor of Graphic NYC, nycgraphicnovelists.com, as well as the new digital comics magazine, The Drawn Word. I'm here, as the card tells us, for New York Real and Imagined. Whether you are reading the make-believe worlds of the Yellow Kid, Superman, the Spirit, or Spider-Man, or the graphically documented ones chronicled in the autobio of Art Spiegelman, Dean Haspiel, or Peter Cooper, New York City always takes stage as a central character in comics. How did New York become so ensconced in the cultural memory of the comics medium, and why do we keep going back to it? Why are we held in thrall of the city's skyscrapers, alleyways, and streets? With the help of our 5 panelists, we hope to gather some insight into why New York feels like the only city for the comics medium. Our first guest is Kent Wister, whose comics history work includes the requisite book, A Comics Study Reader, and Argue in Comics, both with Cheat here. Kent is a professor of poli-sci at Marymount Manhattan University. He has also authored C.L.R. James, A Political Biography, and the Social Science Research Council, 1923 to 1998. And he is also the co-editor of Trade Union Politics, Globalization's Paradox. Let's please give Kent a hand.
Thanks very much. I've been speaking on New York City and comics for the New York Council for the Humanities for about 7 years, and mostly at public libraries in outer boroughs and Long Island, and occasionally at senior citizen homes. And the most interesting question I ever got was from a very sweet person who raised her hand and said, "Where's Marmaduke from?" And I had to say that was where my comics knowledge ended. And so if there's a Marmaduke scholar or expert, please let me know. I'm just going to try to go quickly through some very sort of key points about New York City and comics.
Hi, actually finish introducing everyone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But I have I have 5 slides dedicated to Kent.
Okay.
I'm so sorry, Kent. I should have been more clear. Next up.
He was scaring me.
Wait till we get to your slides,
I didn't
Junior.
do my homework last night.
Our next guest, Molly Crabapple, is the founder of Dr. Sketchy's Anti-Art School, which combines cabaret with figure drawing. Her comics work includes the webcomic Backstage and the graphic novel Scarlet Takes Manhattan, both with co-writer John Leavitt. Most recently, Molly released the art book Week in Hell, which chronicles her covering an entire room in original artwork, and she is also preparing for the 2013 release of her graphic novel Straw House, from First Second Books. So please give Molly a hand.
I don't have erudite remarks prepared.
Next up is John ROMITA, who came into comics in the 1950s after graduating from the Manhattan School of Industrial Arts. Mr. ROMITA did work for both Marvel, then Atlas Comics, and DC Comics. In 1965, John began working for the newly christened Marvel Comics, first drawing Daredevil and then taking over the Amazing Spider-Man from departing artist Steve Ditko. Mr. ROMITA made Spider-Man his, giving old Webhead a veneer and a shine he never had before, and everything from Peter Parker's more handsome look to Spidey's more daring appearance. Please, please give John ROMITA Sr. a hand. Following him is another John ROMITA, Jr., that is, who is just as inimitable an artist as his father. Jr. broke out in the 80s through his work on Uncanny X-Men, Iron Man, Daredevil, Spider-Man, and most recently through his work on The Avengers and the creator-owned Kick-Ass with Mark Miller. Not one to be outdone, John Jr. has created his own legacy, one that stands right alongside his father's. I need to get less accomplished guests next time because I'm running out of it here. Finally, Ariel Schrag's autobio cartooning can most recently be seen in her webcomic, Ariel and Kevin Invade Everything, with writer Kevin Ceccia. Her earlier works include the original graphic novels Awkward, Definition, Potential, and Likewise. Ariel is also a writer on the HBO show How to Make It in America, as well as the program The L Word. Since 2003, Ariel has taught the graphic novel workshop at the New School. She is, I'm proud to say, even though I never went here, but I kind of wish I had, a 2003 Columbia graduate with a degree in English literature. So please give Ariel a hand. When Superman first leapt tall buildings in 1938's Action Comics #1, his home city of Metropolis was obviously a cipher of New York. Kent, you have some theories streaming from Superman's first appearance as well as comics in New York in general.
I think I already gave my talk.
Oh, you're killing me.
Okay. I did write out a talk. The nexus of New York and comics is multifaceted, complex, and profound. We have certain basic ideas that are often repeated, and I want to dig a little deeper. What we already know is that numerous creators, editors, publishers work out of the 5 boroughs in the larger tri-state area. We know that numerous stories are set in New York, real and imagined. And we know that New York City itself, its neighborhoods, buildings, architecture, and so on serve as a kind of character or an ensemble of characters. But to grapple with the question of just how entangled the story of comics is with the story of New York City, let's consider 5 images. The first comes from the early 30s, from Frank King's Gasoline Alley. It's a wonderful panel that shows Uncle Walt and Skeezix taking a magic carpet ride over Manhattan. Here we have a portrait of the city through the eyes of a Midwesterner. Better to be up there than down here. It's a tourist's perspective, an outsider's perspective. As Skeezix says, I'd hate to be one of those tiny ants, Uncle Walt. He's talking, of course, about us. This is suggestive of New York City as the other, and I think this is one aspect of New York City in comics that we don't often sort of call attention to, the way in which New York figures not just in stories about New York, but in stories that are set in very different places. Consider how often in Western comics the villain or the fool comes from back east, i.e. New York City, and how in Archie comics, Veronica's parents return from a New York City shopping spree. So the city is a point of reference, negative or positive, sometimes both, in comics set in almost any environment.
And can we move on to the next one?
Yes. The second comes from Superman #1, summer 1939. Superman is dangling a lobbyist over a telephone wire amidst dense skyscrapers. But this image is paradoxical. When I show this image in the New York Council talk, I ask people where they think the image is set or depicts, and people might guess Cleveland because they know where Siegel and Schuster come from. They might say Toronto, but the answer in the story is Washington, D.C., the one city where this image is simply impossible. And I think that is suggestive of a kind of tendency to draw New York even when you can't be drawing New York, which is another profound way in which New York and comics intersect. The third image comes from the famous tragic story from Will Eisner, who Karen mentioned, the story of Gerhard Schnabel, the anonymous New York City schlub who hopes to get promoted that day after 25 years as a sub-janitor to the janitor position. And he gets shot just as he's about to show everyone that he can fly, because he has the power of flight but not the power of invulnerability. Notice how the panels and the composition as a whole invoke the elevator shafts, the verticality of the skyscraper system, a new hyper-packed environment that is only made possible by science and technology, by commerce and capitalism. A single tall building, it's important to remember, is not a skyscraper. It's only when you have a group of tall buildings clustered together that you have skyscrapers. And so skyscrapers are part of a system. And many American comics are fixated on this quintessentially modern 20th century way of organizing urban space. Speaking of superheroes, it seems to me that the superhero is a decades-long referendum, and I think Schnabel is a kind of parodic, failed superhero on modern life as it's experienced in New York and other large cities. Superman tells the optimistic case, the immigrant can land a good job at the center of the action. Batman explores the contrasting case that even the wealthiest city residents are overwhelmed by the forces of chaos generated by the city's dysfunctionality. Speaking of density, we have this fourth image by Jack Kirby. I don't have a date for it. I pulled it off of Google Images, of course.
75.
Oh.
Yeah, it's
wow.
kind of tiny there. Of course,
it's
Ken
a bigger
didn't have
image
a
here than it
projector.
was on my little computer. But here, notice that he's navigating the cosmos as if he's weaving his way past tourists in Times Square. If you've ever traveled through space on a surfboard, and who hasn't, you'll know that space is pretty much empty. But as a true New Yorker, Kirby can't help but organize space, both outer space and inner space, that is the space of the page and the space of the cosmos, rather differently, as a collision of objects all vying for room, all asserting themselves so that the hero has to step lively and keep moving.
So what is it they say, Kent? You can take the boy out of New York City, but you can't take the New York City out of the boy?
You can take the surfboard out of the Silver Surfer. The final image comes from the early 90s, from a 4-part special Punisher series called POV. The book was written by Jim Starlin and drawn by Bernie Wrightson. And this page shows Frank Castle making his way across the Hudson via helicopter and then swimming because the city's closed to him. The bridges and tunnels are full of police. So he decides to jump out of a helicopter, since the police wouldn't think to look in the sky and say, "Who's that falling out of a helicopter?" Apart from the sheer impracticality of sneaking onto Manhattan this way, what strikes me about this page is the way in which the panels mimic the skyscraper system I was talking about earlier. Which brings me to my last point, the grid. Apart from density, human density, apart from the density of architecture and the skyscrapers, one of the most distinctive features of Manhattan is the way in which it's organized around a series of rectangular grids. The grid system dates back to the early 19th century and represents an attempt not only to control and regulate the development of space, in part to facilitate real estate transactions, but also as part of an effort to improve public health by clearing the air of insects, and to make a break with a European style of city that features boulevards and crescents. In a traditional European city, you always know whether you're in a wealthy neighborhood or in a poor neighborhood by how much space there is between the buildings or across the street. Sorry, that's fine. So my only point is that New York City is embedded in the history of American comics.
Thank you so much, Kent. And one of something Kent and I were discussing over coffee a couple weeks ago is how New York works from either a claustrophobic perspective or this great wide open, things are either small or they're large, basically. So my questions for the guests, starting with John ROMITA and working towards me, is how do you use the claustrophobia or scale and grandness of New York in your work?
Well, my son is really the expert on New York City.
I'm not following him.
No, I tried to avoid as many bricks and windows as I could have. And in fact, my experience with New York City has been two classic errors that everyone points out in the history of comics. My first Spider-Man story, I had Spider-Man swinging above the Empire State Building. And Stan was asked by a fan letter, where was he swinging from? And Stan said, from a helicopter, of course. All right, the second thing was on Stan. That was my embarrassment. Second was on Stan. I did The Death of Gwen Stacy, which is classic. I had her falling from the Brooklyn Bridge. Stan wrote it as the George Washington Bridge. So Stan and I both have a blush in New York history. But I tried to avoid as many buildings as I could. I used to do every trick in the book, including smoke and silhouettes. My son does every window in New York. He probably knows every building in New York by heart, and he's an expert on it. But I will tell you that Spider-Man, New York City is a co-star with Spider-Man. The whole atmosphere and the fact that you have to go so many different directions at one time, you can see from the films. So the point is that New York City has been, since Peter Parker was raised in Forest Hills, and he goes from Queens to New York every time, is amazing. A lot of other people don't bother with that kind of detail. But my son started to think when he was 9 years old that Peter Parker was a neighbor of ours. That's my connection with New York City.
And JR?
I have no idea what the hell to say. He covered everything. I didn't think of doing this. It was part of the job. I had to do Spider-Man in New York City. And I had to get a library card to get reference on the city itself. He gave me some photographs of Manhattan and the city in the 50s, and I had to get reference on the city in the 70s. And I remember I left college, I used the library at school. When I left college, I didn't have a library card. I had to go get a library card. I went to libraries and I got mimeograph copies of books. You know, the smell of mimeograph, that's back when I was, okay, never mind.
That blue ink.
And I had to get reference on the Twin Towers, and Spider-Man was battling a character around the Twin Towers. And I still have that issue, and it's very uncomfortable to look at. But I had to bring Spider-Man, I had to bring the city into the book because it was the job. I didn't think of it as part of a greater scheme in it being a character. Later on, as I was doing Spider-Man for the fourth or fifth time, I remember an editor telling me, remember, this city is one of the characters in Spider-Man. And I said, and I wasn't nasty towards him. I said, of course, it goes without saying. But that was the first time somebody had actually said that to me. And I did the series with Straczynski, right? And it was ever present in the city. And but I was able to get the reference off the internet as opposed to going to a library. And I remember thinking it was a whole lot easier. I didn't have to get dressed up. But I have stacks of my morgue in my office is endless from pre-internet days. And now my stack of internet photographs on cheap paper is now rivaling that. And I'm running out of room in my office. And so I was thrust into it. I didn't think of it. And I just had to follow along. And when it became important to you to do the city as a character, I really embraced it, because then everything I learned in college, everything I learned from him came into play. And suddenly design, the city helped with the designs, as opposed to me having to design something. The shape of buildings and the shape of the skyline helped me design something as opposed to the other way around.
And one question I have for you, JR, because you're also known for Daredevil as well. How is Daredevil's New York different from Spider-Man's New York?
It's a much more somber and moody look as opposed to Spider-Man. Spider-Man's a more open character, and it seems like the editors, when I did Daredevil, always wanted the scenes at night, which is a little easier. But I also work with a writer who was a very bohemian type of a writer named Ann Nesenti, who would fit into this university perfectly. And we varied in our storylines. It was animal rights and so on, but Daredevil was always in at night. The character was always based at night. Spider-Man is much more daytime and much more sunlight, I guess you could say, just because it's unimportant that it's at night. The costume doesn't lend itself towards mood.
No.
Daredevil does.
And Molly, your web strip actually, backstage in your graphic novel Scarlet Takes Manhattan, takes place in the early days of burlesque. In drawing this period New York, where did you turn, and did you view New York as a very claustrophobic place or a very open area?
One of the big references that I used for Scarlet Takes Manhattan and Backstage is Luc Sante's Low Life, The Lures and Snares of Old New York, which is his history of tenements and criminality and political machines. The New York that I kind of, that most resonates with me and that I grew up with isn't necessarily the New York of like sweeping glass skyscrapers and Saks Fifth Avenue. It's the New York of brownstones that never get really clean, where paint is just applied, in layers upon layers, and there's curly iron work, and there might be grand marble fireplaces, but there's graffiti on them. That sort of fractal, hyper-detailed aesthetic is something I use a lot in my work, and something that you see in Scarlet Takes Manhattan and in Backstage. You see lots of brownstones and cobblestone streets. And I was listening to John, he's talking about using smoke to hide buildings. Oh God, yes, so much smoke. The smoking sewers of New York are the artist's friend. That's how you know the city was meant for us.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But I don't just see New York as buildings or as architecture. I see New York primarily as the place where broke kids come, and with style and grit and hustle and overwhelming work, they try to ascend to that point in life when you have a washing machine in your apartment. So the New York that I draw is very often it's very often the stage for crazy, ambitious performers and writers and artists and bohemians, and that's what I've tried to reflect in my books.
And Ariel, you don't really set your work in New York, but you are a New Yorker. Most of your comics take place in LA, correct?
Well, my high school series takes place in Berkeley, California, where I grew up.
And your current work is LA?
Not really.
Really? Okay. All right, well, I quenched that one then. Okay, so, but what my question is how does the New York lifestyle inform your work when you sit down and do an autobio?
Well, actually, yeah, I think in my 12th grade book, likewise, is about my senior year of high school, and I was completely obsessed with New York. I mean, it was just, I was sort of one of those teenagers that just sort of had this dream of moving to New York and living in a basement and just drawing comics nonstop. And I was able to follow that dream, and the basement flooded and everything. So it was, it met all of my tragic fantasies. And in Likewise, you'll actually, it's funny when they were talking about the grid, the sense of the grid, there's this one panel, and I kind of wish I'd given it to you, but I didn't think of it, where there's just this, I just have this one image of a fantasy of New York, and it's just this completely compact grid of buildings with like sort of made up of little dots that are stars. And that was just sort of my image of New York, was just like a grid that was like black with little dots of stars. And
the stars are made of gold, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Just wanted to clarify.
And then I when I first moved to New York, it was I moved to Fort Greene, and I was kind of like, this doesn't look like New York. But eventually, yes, I did sort of get to experience that vision, sort of traveling over the Williamsburg Bridge, and I think for me, like, even though I haven't drawn so many comics that take place in New York, just a few short ones, that sense of just the sort of creative hub and dense sort of devotion to whatever you're doing is what I think of when I think of New York.
Wonderful. I was a little dissuaded when I moved up here because it didn't look a thing like Friends. You cannot actually be an unemployed actor and get an apartment off Central Park. What did I know? Anyways, on to our next question. We have three major cartoonists who, at least in my case, I view when I think of New York. Our first cartoonist is obviously Will Eisner. When he first drew The Spirit in the 1940s, the crime fighter's home of Central City was obviously a New York cipher. When Will created his first graphic novel, A Contract with God, in 1978, it presented a seemingly more open New York, as his artwork had loosened up a bit with age. This page right here is from his autobiographical kind of sort of memoir, The Dreamer, from 1986. Next up is Jack Kirby, who grew up in the Lower East Side, and as we all know him, he helped define the Marvel age of comics with Stan Lee in the 1960s. This is actually from Avengers #4, when Captain America comes out of deep freeze and finds New York is radically different, and the hairdos, how different they are. I totally love that panel. Jack went ahead and gave us a glimpse into his childhood in the Lower East Side in Street Code from 1983. This is actually straight from his pencils. As you can see, it's a much different type of New York than the bright and shiny New York with stars of gold and mod hairdos than we see here. Finally, there's Frank Miller, who, when he started with Daredevil in the late 70s, I believe, his elemental New York very much combined the atmosphere of Eisner's with the power of Kirby's, with a lot of water towers thrown in for good measure. So my question, and of course there's The Dark Knight Returns, that famous splash, and it's Gotham, but we know it's New York. So my question for each of the panelists, actually we're going to start with John and then work our way back to Kent because we're running a little tight on time, is, well, starting with John, when you came to Marvel in the 60s, did you have any direction to draw the Kirby New York, or did you rely more on drawing from the New York outside your window?
I got no instructions at all, just the plot, and generally left to our own devices. Most of what happens, except if John is getting a very definitive plot today, I never got definitive plots. I got a half hour of possibilities, which half of them slipped through my memory. And I used to go home and try to patch together what I thought we had decided to do. And I just made it up as I went along. The buildings, Jack Kirby's interesting because you showed the Lower East Side, all of the buildings and the automobiles are like in the 30s and the late 20s. Jack was drawing 1930s automobiles into the 50s. And we used to kid him about it. And he used to say, you know, they have fins on some of the cars.
Well, you know, Kirby couldn't drive. That might be why.
Well, the thing is, he just only saw things the way he originally envisioned them, and it was interesting because he did. You could see how he modernized the Fantastic Four. I mean, all you had to do was tip him, and he would immediately improve it. I was just doing buildings that I could get away with. A building that would represent a New York City street with as little work as possible, because I was always late. That's the only thing I could tell you. Deadline. John used to say it's the deadline style of art.
Still say it. Whatever comes out on time is.
And that's a good segue into John Jr. This splash panel is from Daredevil, The Man Without Fear, written by Frank Miller. It's actually, I was reading this in my freshman year class.
Oh, shit.
I know, I shouldn't have been. And I was an art major, and that's why I'm a writer now, because of this comic. It was my first discovery of John Romita Jr.'s Daredevil with Al Williamson inks and Frank Miller's script. So when you drew off of Miller's script and when you drew Daredevil...
It was a plot, and it was a huge tome. It gave
enormous?
No dialogue, per se. It was just very little dialogue, just a lot of...
You didn't
It
write
was
the
a
dialogue
movie
into it?
treatment that got rejected, that he decided to let me go with. And when he talks about little or more, I get scripts now, but they're hybrid scripts. There's a combination of plot and script, whereas I used to get plots, and it was much more liberating getting plots. Even something as extensive as something from Frank. And it was pretty much do whatever you want, just make sure editorially it's this story. And it started out as 80 pages and it morphed into 144.
Did it, my question is, did you feel that you had to refer to Miller's New York to draw this, or did you still draw, John Romita Jr.'s?
There was never that intimation from him, and I never thought of it that way. I did it whatever was in my head. And I didn't think of it. I did, at some point, give Frank a couple of images that he was familiar with, design-wise. Interestingly enough, where I would think that this is what Frank would do was stuff that we were both doing when we started, because we both started at the same time. And Frank's Daredevil was ubiquitous at that time when we were doing this graphic novel. But I still gave it my designs, and he was constantly telling me how much he enjoyed it, and at one point said, I think you did it first, kind of thing. This is while he was doing a screenplay for RoboCop or something like that. So he was yelling at me via phone. But he was so much fun to work with because we pretty much designed and story told the same way. So it worked out nicely.
Yeah, you guys were just, you worked hand in hand. And it's, I mean, I'm just going to fanboy out for a sec, but it's one of my favorite comics ever. But
Thank you.
so given your current work on Kick-Ass 2 and Avengers, which New York do you do? Do you still do the, what's the John Romita Jr. New York?
It's the one that's out there right now. I work with a guy named Mark Miller who is absolutely enamored with all things New York, and constantly has me doing things in Times Square in the middle of the day, which is the most crowded.
There's a cast of thousands.
Yeah. And it used to bother me, but now it's flattering because they seem to think I'm the Cecil B. DeMille of comics. And it's annoying, and I usually have to take more time. But everything I do is based in New York, and I'm just so used to it now that whereas I began with images and reference on the city, now I design the illustrations and get details after the fact. In other words, I can do things without having to reference, unless it's a specific location. I can do it without referencing photographs, and that's fun. But then I'll always go back to, I'll put up an image, a double spread image photograph on my desk, on my drafting table, just to give me a little flavor. And so again, I've done it so often, and now I'm doing it so much presently with Kick-Ass and even with the Avengers. I don't need to begin with photographs. I use it afterwards for the finishing.
Awesome. And next on to Molly. This is a page from her web strip Backstage. And now, interestingly enough, with your work, Molly, I don't really see a Kirby, I don't really see an Eisner, I don't see a Miller. I see a Richard Outcault Yellow Kid, which that's a little, it's not the best image, I'm afraid, but, you know, I see the alleyways teeming with people, you know, climbing over one another, shoving, and just tell me where you get your New York from.
I think I get my artistic style from Bosch more than any other artist. But where do I get my New York from? I think Thomas Nast, political cartoons, scathing satire. I'm pitifully uneducated about comics. It's one of my shameful admissions that I think I'm making here for the first time. So I come to things more from a historical illustration perspective. For Backstage, I just wanted to get every single type of person I could find in New York, from like rich bankers to prostitutes to, to people running fake opium dens that were aimed at Midwestern tourists, and shove them all into the same canvas so that if you just stared at it for a while, you could keep finding new things.
Awesome.
I have another answer, quick.
Yes, quick.
I just thought of something relatively intelligent. I grew up watching films with my father. Everything seemed to be based in New York City. It was all buildings. Whether it was Abbott and Costello movies or anything else, cops and robbers movies, it was Manhattan. I started in comics, and it was Manhattan. I'm born and raised in the city, in Queens. It's ever present in my life. Even when I lived in California, all I had was reference on the city. So it comes from the fact that I'm it and it's me.
It's in your DNA. I think it is really in our cultural
So does Molly
DNA.
come from that area?
I don't come from the Lower East Side. I come from Far Rockaway, actually. No, it's totally true. Sometimes I feel like I look at people from New York and I feel like we're like viper fish or angler fish or one of those fish from the deep ocean that if you take it up to the lab, it kind of explodes because it was bred to exist under extreme pressure. Sometimes I look at how claustrophobic my panels are, and I think of the first apartment that I had in New York, which was one room, no windows, 3 roommates, divided up by shower curtains, and we each paid $600 a month because we wanted to live in Manhattan. And I would work with my. I didn't really even have a table. I would just sort of work with my like little painting propped up against the wall in this dark room, and I'd have to draw small because there was no room to do anything bigger, and. You just try to cram everything in because that's how we are. We're crammed in here.
That is great. Yeah, the apartments are so much smaller here than where I used to live. Don't get me started. All right, Ariel, this is actually Columbia set strip, correct?
Yes. This is a comic about when I was a freshman at Columbia.
Punching someone.
Oh, jeez.
What's that? Oh, sorry. Yes, I punched someone in the face at Barnard and was actually banned from the Barnard campus for 2 years.
That is awesome. The things you learn when you do panels.
But yeah, so this,
Can we hear the story?
the story, yeah, basically, I mean, it involved alcohol, big surprise. It also just involved the concept of a gay prom, which to me is so wrong. And like the fact that also like, a lot of these, we weren't allowed to be gay at our proms in high school. So then you like finally get one at college and you have all this pent up bitterness and just like turns into a fight. I don't know.
Literally.
Someone told my friend that she was the most irritating person she'd ever met, and so then I decided to avenge her. It's actually very comic-like. There was a lot of like vengeance and.
So it was one of those situations where it's like, okay, man, there's going to be 2 hits: me hitting your
Yes.
face, you hitting the floor.
It was
Totally.
exactly that. It was sort of me being like, yeah, we're gonna kick her ass, and my friend being like, I got your back, I got your back. And we like went around and like rounded up back up around the dance. And basically, it ended up in my friend totally getting her ass kicked, like 7 butch dykes punching her and kicking her with steel-toed boots. And I had like rolled off somewhere and was like trying to fix my glasses, which had like sort of come loose.
A woman of your education. This is
I
unbelievable.
know, right?
I had a question for her, but I don't know if I can follow that. It's
But yes, the whole comic takes place on the Barnard and Columbia campus and in my Columbia John Jay dorm room. That's it.
that is just incredible. Okay, well, I actually have a question. How much did the New York culture and living in New York and going to Columbia inform your future work, whether it's I'm sorry, I think I'm a little lightheaded. I laughed a bit too hard. Whether it's set in California or anywhere else, set it in a room in any city.
Well, I actually would really love to draw more comics about New York. I do have one comic, a short comic in process called My Troubles with Glasses, about trying to buy a new pair of glasses and basically going to all the different lens crafters in the city.
Is this after they got knocked off during?
This is after I've graduated
Okay.
college, so I'm just
Okay.
like living in Williamsburg and don't have a job, so instead like fuel all my energy into buying a new pair of glasses. And yeah, basically just would sort of kept returning the glasses to every lens crafter, so then felt shamed and couldn't go back. So kind of went to like 7 different glasses stores in New York. So you kind of see me traveling throughout New York through the theme of glasses. But there is one scene actually that reminds me of some of the images we've seen here tonight, where I'm going to pick up like, I don't know, like the 5th pair of glasses or something, and I'm just full of shame and horror, and my sister is driving me, and I know I'm gonna have to return them. I just have this feeling, and all of a sudden like the sky just turns dark, and we look up, and it's like this weird like apocalypse, like one of those just weird sort of what it's called, like a nor'easter or something, like
Right.
where it's just like dark at like completely black at like 3 p.m. And it's just me looking up at like the sort of skyscrapers, like sort of zooming in, and this rain crashing down. And to me, that was a sort of very classic New York moment, feeling sort of overwhelmed by the city.
Thank you. And I have one question for Kent. When comics started in the 1930s, comic books, I should specify, New York really was, we still are at the hub, but New York was where all comics came from. You had to live in New York if you wanted to do comic books. There was no FedEx and so forth. That's probably a big part of why New York is so ingrained in the American comic book. As we become more globalized, Kent, do you see New York losing its place as the city of honor, be it a cipher or the actual New York City?
That's a hard one. I'm still sort of digesting all the great things that have been said. I think we should run Ariel for mayor. I think.
Yeah, I would hate to have to follow up her answer.
I think that just the glasses, the gay prom.
She could like drop lobbyists from telephone lines.
Yeah.
I was gonna say power lines, but I just learned we don't have power lines in New York. I never noticed it till someone mentioned it.
Yeah. I mean,
Go ahead.
just quickly, I mean, it is one of those industries that didn't decamp. I mean, it didn't flee to the suburbs. Obviously, there are people who transmit their work electronically, and and there is a sort of inevitable dispersion to some extent. But it's striking how the companies have largely remained in New York, and occasionally on the web you'll see somebody say, ooh, Eugene, Oregon, we have so many cartoonists. And there are streets in Brooklyn that have more cartoonists than Eugene, Oregon. I mean, the whole Pacific Northwest pales in comparison to what certain sections of the city have to offer. I mean, at one point the city had 3 museums devoted to comics, one of which was sort of a dodgy enterprise, one of which was about to move, and MoCA, which is, celebrating its 10th anniversary? Into the 11th. So it seems like MoCA, this conference, and maybe future Columbia-related conferences, collections, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways in which New York can remain at the center of the story of comics for decades to come.
I work with Mark Miller. Mark Miller works with about 5 other artists, and they're all from different countries, Philippines, Scotland, England, and each of them have work that's based in the city, in New York City. And I get copies of their work by the internet, and because of the reference that you can get, anything and everything, it's spot on. And these guys have never been to the city in some cases. So, yeah, it still is, and it will be, as long as you can just hit the enter key, you get the reference. Daniel will remember this. Unfortunately, I did a job with a writer that I won't mention anymore, but I had to do it in Pittsburgh. You know what I'm talking about?
It was Irving Forbush, wasn't it?
No, and that wasn't the problem. Pittsburgh's
No
a great
relation.
city, but I had to get a reference on Pittsburgh, and I got the reference for wherever I got it. I forgot where the hell I got it from. And in order to make it look like Pittsburgh, I had to use the bridges where the 3 rivers meet. And I began it, and I said, I'm not going to do bridges. This is a pain in the ass. So I did buildings. And to get the distinction between the building architecture in Pittsburgh and Manhattan is very subtle, and it's not easy to distinguish. So I even put Pittsburgh Hall of Fame on a wall somewhere. I had no idea. I had to do something because the writer was mad at me. He says, this doesn't look like Pittsburgh. It looks like Manhattan. So I give me a location, and he gave me some. Well, but I didn't want to do something so complicated. I was such a pansy about it.
Forbes Field, right.
My point is that it's such a subtle difference between cities because of the architecture. And unless you put in the 3 rivers and all of those bridges, it's a subtle difference. And I was not going to do that. But again, it looked like the city. It looked like New York City to me when I was done. Even though it was Pittsburgh architecture. Even the writer couldn't tell the difference.
Wow. New York's in your blood. It's inescapable. Well, that about wraps up my section. I'd like to open the floor to any questions. So, it's right there by the projector.
Okay. So do you guys ever go on sketching trips in the city, or just hey, there's something new, I want to see what the street's looking like, the street park?
I was lucky enough, or I am lucky enough, to live right next to Occupy Wall Street. And when that first started happening, I would go down pretty much every day with my iPhone camera and take pictures of the protesters and just of people, doing stuff there and do sketches of them. That was my first time doing real serious reportage of New York. And yeah, it's really rewarding to get to do that, and helps your style a lot.
The only time I ever did it was when I was single. And a gentleman by the name of Maury Kuramoto, who was an older man when I met him, told me the best way to meet women is to go to a bar and
With a
draw.
sketch cans.
Go to a location, a restaurant or bar, and draw. And I did it, and he was right. So nothing so classy as I want to draw images of people. I was trying to meet women.
But the flip side is that it is impossible to draw in a bar as a woman.
Oh, sure.
Someone will come up to you.
That's true. Nobody came up to me. I had to go up to people. Look what I'm drawing.
When I was 17, I got a job at a lithography house. I was working at Forbes Lithograph doing Coca-Cola bottles. At lunchtime, I took a publisher's dummy, a hardcover book, no sketch pad, and I did drawings of drunks asleep in Bryant Park. I did people sunning themselves with the reflectors. I did drawings of little children. This one drunk I have about 10 drawings of him. He always had one shoe off. He was out on his face, cold, and the shoe was always like 5 feet away from him. And I drew him like in every angle possible. I did the arch behind Bryant Park. I did some of the buildings. I did the back of the library. And I did hundreds of drawings, stray cats, whatever I could. But I also used to carry it around, and I delivered packages when I was 15. I delivered packages all through Times Square and up to 57th Street. I used to deliver. And I carried it with me. And when I was waiting for a bus or just in a doorway waiting for rain to stop, I would draw people wherever they were.
He did stuff at that age that I can't do now.
Yeah, I still have some of those drawings. I've got.
You missed the compliment.
What was that?
As a teenager, at 15, he was doing things that a lot of artists can't do
Actually,
now.
I was better then than I ever was.
No.
It's true. I'm true. I still have those. But I gave away tremendous valued art. I gave them away, but I kept those sketches. Go figure.
We have time for some more questions.
My question, I can ask that you guys to kind of prognosticate the future. When I think about New York, you guys have a lot of common themes in your work, possibilities, New York and everything. What do you think are things that are going to change in New York in the future? Trends you see, like territory. When I think about New York, recent changes, I think of surveillance, I think of Canada, I can see that in the future. What are the changes that you see that just come down the changing how New York
Just topically, you alluded to that. Anything that happens newsworthy is going to change a story or the way you draw. 9/11 changed the way I drew things. I had to do a Spider-Man issue based on it, and it changed things. You're right, surveillance, police, ever-present, no longer the Twin Towers to draw, but I'll be able to do Freedom Tower. So it changes according to news and according to events.
I think the point about surveillance is really interesting, and it's also a two-way surveillance. If I was depicting New York, I might draw people constantly staring into their iPhones and capturing everything around them. It's like we're being watched, but we're watching also, and it's this constant two-way feed of the robot eye.
I would just quickly say that I think that the rivers are becoming more important. That when I first moved to New York, very few people spent time around water. And I think that, there's a possibility that sometime this century, water will become a sort of threat to parts of New York through flooding. But the access to the water is so much greater.
Do you think that's because maybe the city's become a little bit more cluttered?
Partly. And of course, 150 years ago, water was where immigrants came and diseases and so on, and that's why Fifth Avenue and Madison were sort of the wealthiest areas, because it was the furthest from the waterfront. And there's been a sort of tendency now to move in the other direction, where the waterfront is now some of the most valuable property.
This is actually kind of a follow-up to the previous two questions, and it is more focused for the ROMITAs. When you're dealing with a pre-existing continuity, coming in and dealing with it, and with the time compression that goes in with the stories of these characters who are, a quarter of the age that they're really supposed to be, you have a changing face of New York, and how do you deal with that? For instance, with Daredevil being the protector of Hell's Kitchen, it's like, do Chelsea theater goers, really need their own protector? And Delancey Street today is not, the Yancey Street of Ben Grimm's youth and that sort of thing. And, I found it amusing when they replaced Daredevil briefly with Black Panther. It's like you have the upper middle class people being protected by a defrocked king. It's like, how do you deal with it, with the inherent anachronisms of this, of New York today not being the New York of these characters' backgrounds?
You're the guy do it.
Do I have to? Aesthetically, it's simple. Just follow as things change and get updated reference. Deeper than that, the writer might have to adapt. But I don't.
That was my point.
Honestly, as an artist, design is design, and then you just update your images as far as new buildings or, for instance, Times Square has changed so drastically since I began in the industry that that was a major amount of reference. And now the way businesses come and go and buildings change because of that, I'm a little stickler for details. I will get, like I said, the stack of reference I have is getting monumental. It's an aesthetic with me. You just have to change as the city itself changes, which is kind of exciting.
I will add one thing. One of the things that we were talking about, intent and proactive influence of the city. One of the main things that Stan and I always paid attention to was we were not reporters and journalists. We were like a mirror reflecting the culture as it was in '65 and in '75 and in '85. As that mirror, we were just saying this is the way it was then, and Stan's only other orders were, I don't want anything done in '85 to look like it was done in '75. So the city's growth is automatically built into our plot and artists' arrangement, and we try not to create as much as reflect.
Kind of adding on to that, I grew up in the 90s. That's when I was really reading comics. And I feel like kind of the Frank Miller, Daredevil, Hell's Kitchen, New York was kind of had an arrested development in the 90s because of the kind of dark, grim and gritty comics that were coming out. So when I actually moved up here, when I first came to New York even, I was expecting it to be like the New York of the 80s action movies and, you know, of the very violent comics I had read, you know, with people with gritted teeth all the time. And it's not. But I feel like that New York has kind of got stuck for a little while, for maybe a decade longer than it needed to be. But that's just my 2 cents.
No, that's true, and I think a lot of people like Frank Miller added a little bit more of the grime and the darkness of it.
Because when he started and when I started, that's what the city looked like in the 70s.
Well, I think he added a little level to it when he did the artwork, and also Joe Quesada had the same kind of he would add a layer of religious and cultural clashes that would give you the idea that every street corner is a battleground in New York. Yeah. So the thing is, John and I think, look at the sunnier side of things than Frank Miller and Joe Quesada. That's all I can tell you.
That's because of Daredevil, interestingly enough.
That's
it's the
right.
character that does that.
Yes. I did him smiling and he did him pouting.
I'm working with Howard Chaykin on a create-our-own project based on 2 characters that grew up with my parents named Schmuggy and Bimbo. And I went to Howard Chaykin with the story, and it was going to be in the 40s. Howard Chaykin preferred to make it into the 70s because we both grew up as single guys in the 70s, and he said it was much more interesting visually than the city is now. Mm-hmm. And there's varying degrees of that opinion. There are people that say that Times Square looks like Disneyland now compared to the way it was, which is true. And Howard Chaykin is one that believes the city was much more interesting visually in the 70s than it is now. I don't necessarily agree, but it's much more interesting to draw. But it's along the lines of what Frank drew in Daredevil.
Yeah, it was like first time I went to Hell's Kitchen, I'm like, wow, this is a pretty happy place. So our next question.
I have a question for John Sr. I grew up reading your comics, and when I actually moved out here, I come from a small town on the West Coast. When I came out here, I was absolutely shocked to realize that water towers were real.
You thought we made them up?
I assumed that. I think someone at some point explained to me what they were, but I couldn't believe that the structures were real. But earlier you mentioned having to make deadlines and the simplest way of drawing a building. Yet, in your comics, you seem to lavish a lot of attention on water towers, so I'm curious as to why.
You know, I'll tell you, I think that's a reaction. Marie Severin was a colleague of mine for about 20 years at Marvel. We worked together at the office. And she was very critical, and she used to always upset my apple cart. She considered that I did New York, apropos of our subject matter. My New York was like it was just finished. No bricks were damaged. There were no cracks in the sidewalk. There was no debris on the curbs. Marie's vision of New York was a filthy place. She lived in Queens, and to her, Manhattan was a pigsty. And if I didn't put a crack on every corner and every street corner and dent some cars, she used to say, your city looks like it was just built, like a Disney version. So she always ridiculed me. So I ended up having to do water towers more grimy and more dingy and dented and ugly because she asked me to do it. So I'm just a victim of following orders.
Speaking of the grid, when I was first drawing backgrounds, it was just simple squared off buildings, and he told me break it up with a couple of
spires and
water towers, and it was a revelation. It was a design revelation. It was all of a sudden, instead of just the square tops of buildings, it was the angle of some buildings, as in the city core building, and then also the water towers. And it was suddenly a new tool.
But you see the shot that Frank Miller did. He had like 5 water towers where there could have been 1. He just loved the fact that he was getting all the variety on the silhouettes.
I would debate whether New York was really sanitized. I think what's happened is that it's moved off of the streets and onto Craigslist. You know, I think that everything's sorted and everything that people are nostalgic about happens now. It just happens behind closed doors and to richer people.
Jan Morris wrote a book called Manhattan 1945. On the cover is a photograph of people at a nice, nightclub. Then I looked at the small print. The photo was taken in 1943. Those people could be dead by 1945. So that got me very angry. But there was a comment that Jan Morris made that was amazing. I never thought of it. He said basically New York didn't change from 1920s to 1950. We think of it as a dynamic place, but technically the politics was about the same, the habits of the people about the same, the ethnic, because of the immigration stoppage, about the same, the streets, there wasn't that much thing. So I think that the comic books really had an advantage there, that they could really have a recognizable 30-year period where that's New York and everybody in the world knew it.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, actually it is. I was just going to say we have about 2 minutes left, so if someone's ready to go with a question.
I know this focus was more on, you could say, the more street level and higher up level of New York. I was wondering, how do you perceive almost, you could say, the pastoral element in New York, which are the parks and stuff like the High Line and also the underground?
I've always viewed the subway system as the sort of hair shirt of New York City, the sort of foul intestine that we have to plunge ourselves into to give us humility from living in such a sparkling silver Babylon.
She's full of metaphors. This is awesome.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that the filth and grime and graffiti of the subway is an awesome subject.
That's great. Well, we are actually out of time, so I would love to thank everyone for being here. I would love to thank the panelists. We have a table set up in the hallway for if you want to buy some books and get them signed by all 5 of our amazing panelists. So thanks again. This was great.